Up next is DeWayne Wilson talking on concrete bridge decks in Montana.
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is DeWayne Wilson. Started with Montana in January of this year. Previously, I worked about 37 years at Washington State DOT. So, kind of designed this presentation as kind of a little bit of what I've learned in Montana since January, and then we'll talk about concrete bridge decks. Couldn't decide on which picture to choose, so it depends on Montana if you like the summers or the winters. Both seasons are remarkable. There's lots to see there. This is called the Two Medicine River Bridge. It's up by Glacier National Park, so a pretty iconic bridge. As far as the agenda, I'm going to talk about some fun facts and then get into some of the concrete deck general information, cracking, overlays. Kind of from my perspective, from an owner's perspective, kind of an overview of what I know and what I've learned. Montana is a big state. It's fourth biggest in the United States. Some of the monikers or names of Montana is the Big Sky Country, Treasure State, Mountain State. It's all of that. Population about 1.1 million, but according to a source I've found, about 12.6 million visitors per year, 3 million visitors to Glacier National Park. So there's a lot of people coming to Montana, especially in the summertime. And so we need those bridges to be in good condition to get those visitors and residents to those destinations. I'm just going to give a shout out to the state animal of Montana, which is the grizzly bear. I picked up this book. The book is from Scott McMillan. It's called Mark of the Grizzly, True Stories of Recent Bear Attacks and Hard Lessons Learned. And so, I don't want to scare you, but this might scare you. If you read this book and if you're an outdoor person, definitely going to be, respectful and bear aware because, things do happen out there in the wilderness. One interesting fact from the book is if you're riding a horse, there's been no documented bear attacks of people riding horses. So if you want to go in the wilderness, maybe get a horse. This picture is bear tracks under the Two Medicine River Bridge. So if you're a bridge inspector in Montana, you might see some bears. Just a kind of a question out there, just since we have continuing education unit, you got to throw out a question. Which river in Montana has the most vehicular bridge crossings? I'll let you kind of chew on this, and then at the end, we'll kind of go over the answer. But we got the Missouri River, Yellowstone, Clark Fork. So I'll let you chew on that. As far as what this Montana Department of Transportation, how it's structured, there's 5 districts, and they're named kind of around the cities, Missoula, Butte, Great Falls, Billings, and Glendive. The Bridge Bureau is kind of structured the same way. I'm the bridge area engineer for the Missoula district, which is western Montana, and so I'm looking over all the bridge design projects in that district. And then as far as like the scope and scale, you got your interstate routes. Interesting, if you were to drive from Idaho over to South Dakota just on Interstate 90, 94, take you about 10 hours, 700 miles. The good news is you can drive 80 miles an hour legally, so that's kind of fun. If you're driving from south to north, it's about a 6-hour drive. Just looking at the bridge population, about 2,473 state-owned bridges. Of those, 1,347 on the interstate routes, which represents about half of the population by deck area. Locally owned, 2,000 bridges. Again, there's about an 80-20 split based on deck area. If you look at condition of the state-owned bridges, we're looking at about 7% poor, 21% good, and then almost 3/4, 72% fair. Getting into that agenda again, let's get into the concrete bridge decks. I kind of broke it up into 2 classes. You have the integral and non-integral decks, which means there's a deck you could replace and a deck that you can't replace. When you look at that split, there's about 92 to 8%. So, there's different preservation things you need to do for different classes of bridges there. And then as far as the bridge decks themselves, average age, about 45 years, pretty typical, most states. There is over now 100 bridges that have decks that are over 80 years old, with 4 over 100. The picture is Arch Bridge over Yellowstone, which is now over 100 years old, but still in fair condition. The one thing you'll notice in Montana is the ADT is kind of lower. This particular bridge has an ADT of 1,000. Now, if we look at just the bridge types in general, you got concrete, pre-stress, and steel. And so based on this percentage, about 38% steel and 6% concrete, and then 56% pre-stress. And then you got the predominant types there, slab, girder, steel girder, welded girder. And then Montana has a unique type of bridge, which is this 2 girder system. A lot of other states would use steel trusses, but in the 50s and up to the 70s, their Montana engineers were doing this 2 girder design. Here's a picture, an aerial view of what that 2 girder design bridge looks like, and then what it looks like underneath. And then as far as like what type of rebar is used in concrete decks, predominantly it's just the standard reinforcing, but now about 31% has epoxy coated, with a few other types, stainless, and then other types of reinforcing. The standard today is the epoxy coating. And then if you take a breakdown, if you look at the NBI codes and just say, okay, what's the condition based on those NBI codes? You got 41 bridge decks throughout the state that's in poor condition. And then a pretty big population, over 220 bridges, 221, that's in that condition, NBI 5, which is, the next step to dropping down into the 4, poor condition. So, there's bridges on the horizon there that's going to need attention. Split as far as district goes, predominantly west of the divide, which would be the Missoula and the Butte district, quite a bit of bridges that are in the poor condition. And then again, a pretty even split of those bridges in fair condition. Montana uses the AASHTO manual for bridge element inspection, so they are tracking different defects when they're coding up the BMS elements. As far as deck cracking goes, there was a problem with some cracking going on in Montana bridges, especially decks that were replaced in the early 2000s. Montana hired West Jenny Elsner to do a study, look at it. This particular picture is of a deck that was replaced, so it's not too old, and then it all of a sudden was having these breakouts in the deck. And so West Jenny went through and did an evaluation, came up with some recommendations. This is that picture of one of the bridges that had that hole in it. Basically rated fair condition, but it had pretty significant cracking in it. Before the deck was put on it, the deck was rated kind of fair, but it had quite a bit of effervescence and it had an asphalt overlay on it, so it kind of covered it up. So the engineers at the time said this deserved a deck replacement. So they went ahead and designed it, put a 7-inch deck on these pre-stress girders, and so the deck was replaced 2011. This is an I-90 bridge. And then you can see the cracking underneath. There's a pretty, healthy cracking about every 2 to 4 feet. And what was happening is they came up with this term called a jump crack. So you'd have the transverse cracks, but then you'd have these cracks running longitudinals, and then a piece of concrete would fall out. And so what they did to cover up a lot of the cracking was put a polymer overlay on this particular bridge in 2018. As far as overlays go, here's kind of the breakdown of the different types of overlays. Concrete overlays, about 20%, 19%, 247 that I could document. And what I had to do is, there's not an easy way to get the information out of these different types of overlays. You got the BMS elements, you got some NBI data. So I had to go back and look at the plans and build a spreadsheet to kind of come up with this split here. Thin epoxy, pretty significant number, 141 bridges with that. Not so many with the asphalt, and so quite a few bare decks out there still. As far as the concrete overlays go, they've had experience from the mid-'80s on till now. About a 50-50 split if you look at those concrete overlays that are now over 20 years old. And so generally the concrete overlays have been performing pretty well. Generally they're about 2 inches thick. And then I did a split on just looking at the condition. If you look in general, the condition, about half of them are still in good condition. None are in poor, but you got some of them there, about 28 bridges that are in fair NBI 5. And then if you look at the bridges that are over, this was over 30 years old, still a good percentage of them are in still good condition. So we're running an experiment, it's like how long will concrete overlays last in Montana? And so far the number is approaching 40 years, and with the average daily traffic fairly low, they could go way past that. So here's a typical bridge with a concrete overlay on it. As far as polyester overlays, they've only done 4 polyester overlays to date. This one was 2014 on I-90 west of Billings. There's a report that they did to document the installation of these 3 bridges, and everything went pretty well, pretty smooth. As far as polymer overlays, I just threw this picture in there. This is a bridge that's east of Helena. It's over the Missouri River. It's called the York Bridge. It's pretty iconic with the scenery. You can see this big influx of polymer overlays in 2018. They did a job order contract and just did a lot of bridges throughout western Montana that had cracking issues. And so, polymer overlays, they have starting to get some history there of over 20 years old. Most of them are doing pretty well. And so on this York Bridge, it was rated, the deck is rated in good condition. So there was a project that was put together to replace the expansion joints, do a little deck repair, and then put a polymer overlay on it. Set up traffic control, and everything went well. I didn't get a picture of the polymer overlay, but that was recently installed. As far as I asked contract group which types of polymer overlays were typically used recently. So there's a listing there of the ones that have been used. They have a standard spec, so whoever meets that standard spec could be used. Typically, we're expecting about 10, 15 years service life. Cost about, $5 to $7 or $6 to $7 per square foot. So pretty low cost type of prevention as far as if you have cracks in your deck, you want to get those sealed up. As far as asphalt overlays, used on a few bridge decks throughout the state, but generally they're kind of shied away from. As far as deck replacements go, I went through the data and I had to do some digging, but came up with 111 bridges that had deck replacements, which represent about 8% of the network, which is pretty large number. This particular bridge is called the Higgins Bridge in Missoula, and it's a 2-girder bridge, and it's in the process of getting its deck replaced. I was reading some visitor information for the Missoula area. I guess this bridge is going to be renamed the Bear Tracks Bridge, so there's some reasons for that. And so a lot of these names and come from, when Lewis and Clark came through Montana and through this area, they gave a lot of these names to rivers and different sites. As far as the cost of what a deck replacement costs, this is on a pre-stressed girder bridge that was in the Havre area. It's a pretty typical concrete bridge, built in the 70s. So when you do a look at what the costs are, my general number is I kind of round this up to about $300 total project cost of what it costs to replace a deck. Concrete overlay, you'd probably be a third or a quarter of that cost. Just some typical details, going from a 6.5 inch deck to a 7-inch deck plus. This is what the deck looked like in 2019. A lot of spalling, a lot of deterioration. In Montana, they use roadway crews to do bridge maintenance. So the material of choice is asphalt. So you'll see a lot of asphalt patches on the bridges. Not my preference, but that's just the way it's done. And then here's a couple of pictures of what that deck replacement looked like as far as taking the deck all the way off, putting on the epoxy coated rebar, forming up a new deck. This is kind of what happens when you're texting and driving. I mean, I don't know what the actual story was, but this is a bridge on I-90. I don't know how this pickup truck got through here, if they were doing a challenge and see if they were going to get across the bridge without a deck. But, it's just kind of weird. One day you just show up and there's a pickup in your middle of your construction site. So what are you going to do? As far as the two girder bridges, this is called the Trout Creek Bridge. It's on Highway 200. It's over a reservoir. So a decision was made to replace the deck. Here's kind of the location on the map. Very scenic drive on Highway 200. As far as what you need to do is to preserve this bridge. It's over a reservoir. The columns down below are 116 feet tall. So wouldn't be real easy to replace this bridge. So got to preserve it at all costs. So doing a deck replacement made a lot of sense. So here's some pictures of what it looked like before the deck replacement. Deck rating was a 5. And I haven't really figured out the deck rating yet, because in my book, if you're going to replace a deck, it probably should be in poor condition. But that's just the way that their rating system was. And so here's some of the pictures before they put a temporary asphalt overlay on it, before the deck was replaced. Just, BMS elements, they go through and look at the different defects and put the information together. So here's the before and after. Previous deck section, about 28 feet wide, 6¼ inch deck. And then the new deck section was a 6½ inch deck with an 1.5 inch concrete overlay, 32-foot curb to curb. The decision was made to use GCCM. And so HDR and Kiewit kind of teamed up on this project. They used precast deck panels on there, and then they had some innovative ways of getting the crane out and delivering these deck panels. Here's the final product, what you drive over today. This was done in 2020 during COVID, so it was pretty impressive to get that project done. And then here's another view. And if you went through and looked at all the cost, it adds up to be close to $400 a square foot to replace this deck, do bearings and paint the bridge. Compare that to a $50 to $60 million estimated bridge replacement. The $12.6 million rehab is a pretty good investment. And then as far as questions go, as far as our question for the day, which river in Montana has the most vehicular bridge crossings? How many people think it's Missouri? Okay, a few hands there. How many people think Yellowstone? A few hands there. How about the Clark Fork? A few hands there. Okay, the answer is Clark Fork. If you think of I-90 and how many times it crosses over the Clark Fork from Idaho to Missoula, and then different cities like Missoula, there's just a lot of bridges that cross over that. Missouri is a big river, but there's not as many roads that cross over that.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.